Hey there, this is Argeiphontes, and over the course of the next few weeks, I want to do a series of video commentaries on the 5 matches I played on camera during Wild Hunt 2. This is the first video. It happened during round 2 of the tournament, where I got matched against Trynet. I was bringing greatswords, soldiers, and ST Shoop, whereas Trynet brought Consume, Alchemy, and Axeman. So I knew that Trynet had an Axeman deck, and I knew he was playing Alchemy, but the deck I was most afraid of was Consume, so that is what I banned. Trynet, on the other hand, because he was playing Axeman, he just banned my Greatswords deck, because he does not want to queue into that matchup. So looking at our remaining 2 decks, I have Soldiers and Shoop, and Trynet has Axeman and Alchemy. Both of my decks line up fairly well against Alchemy. I should be advantaged as long as I don't make any crazy mistakes. So going into this matchup, I knew that, and in my head I was just telling myself over and over again, don't make any stupid mistakes, don't make any stupid mistakes. Let's just jump into the games. So the first matchup is Soldiers versus Alchemy. Now traditionally, Soldiers should just destroy the Alchemy deck. However, Trynet actually runs a Vicovaro Medic and a Mardrome in his list, and he's able to get a second Mardrome off of Triss. So in theory, Trynet should be able to steal all 3 of my Slave Infantry. This actually shifts the matchup a bit, and I think it is closer to even than a traditional Alchemy list. At this point, I did not know that. So I was like, okay, I'm probably pretty good into this matchup, but we'll see what happens as the game continues. So I start with a very strong opening hand. I have all 3 Slave Infantry, I have 3 of my 4 golds, and I have a Recon and Recruit to fetch sentries. So I'm pretty happy. Trynet's opener is also fairly decent. He has Zarcius, which he immediately started with. That's the card that lets him see my entire deck, and he's busy jotting down notes right now. Other than that, Trynet could use a couple extra novices probably, but he has the Mardrome in hand and he has the Triss, so he's well set up to deny my soldiers. We'll just fast forward a little bit. A lot of these tournament games, we go down to the very last second of the rope before making a decision, so there's going to be a lot of fast forwarding here. So Trynet starts with Zarcius, which makes sense. He gets to see my entire deck, which then by deduction he gets to see my entire hand. Knowing that I'm probably running a fairly standard soldiers list, he can guess that I have all 3 golds and then I have all 3 Slave Infantry in hand. So Trynet immediately goes for the Mardrome on my first Slave Infantry that I played. This makes a lot of sense. He's ahead on points. I'm at no threat of overtaking him. So even though Trynet is on blue coin and he does not want to go down a card, he has enough tempo from the original Zarcius into Roach that he's able to do this. As soldiers, it takes me a couple more turns to set up. So I'm at no risk to Trynet for at least the first 3 turns of the game. Trynet here actually goes for the Triss. What he's looking for is the Mardrome. Unfortunately, he actually missed on that Mardrome. So I'm going to pause here for a bit. If he hit the Mardrome, this game would have been completely different, because he already denied one of my Slave Infantry with his first Mardrome. If he's hit the second Mardrome, he would be able to deny my second Slave Infantry, leaving me with just 1 Slave Infantry. That would have been huge and would have completely changed the dynamic of the game. And I'll mention what could have happened when we get to that stage. So instead, he is forced to pick a Recon, which thins a Novice out of his deck, and then that in turn thins a Nail out of his deck. Not a bad play. It's quite a few points. It's 8 plus 12, giving us 20 points off of the Triss. But in terms of the game plan going into this matchup, it's not exactly what Trynet wanted. So I am in the tank a bit, but I end up just playing a Slave Infantry. there was no reason to really do anything too fancy here. Trynet thinks for a bit here, and he's going to just pass. And the reason he passes is, now that I finished my setup, I have all 3 slave infantry sets on the board. I can very quickly pump out tempo with sentries and threaten to overtake Trynet. So rather than risk not being able to catch up in points, he just takes the pass here. If I ever overtake him on points on my turn, basically Trynet would be forced to lose on even, which means he would go into round 3 rather, down a card. And that is just not where you want to be in this matchup. So here I'm in the tank because I'm thinking about what card I want to expend to catch up to Trynet. It's only a 13-point gap, so it's nothing huge, but I'm just trying to figure out what cards I want to have in my hand versus in my graveyard at the start of round 2 and round 3. I ended up deciding to play my Recruit, and this is because Recruit is a really nice target for Ointment. I can use it to fetch another sentry from my deck, and it's okay to burn 1 sentry early, I think. If I absolutely need the 3rd sentry in round 3, I can just shuffle it back with a Sire. So I win the round, and going into round 2, I just decide to dry pass here. And the reason is soldiers in the long round is pretty favored against Alchemy. That's because of the slave infantry with the sentries. I still have 2 slave infantry and 2 sentries left, which means in a long round situation I should be able to easily keep up with Trynet in points, and then just be able to match Alchemy's finishers. So that is what I do. Trynet, seeing the dry pass, actually opts to go for Cantarella. Yeah, so he plays Cantarella on my side, and he does this because he's able to immediately shoot down the Cantarella with a Viper Witcher and still win the round. So all in all, he drew a card and then he played a card to end the round with just getting the spy out of his hand. That's very important because in round 3, having minus 13 points from the spy, even though it draws a card, generally isn't worth it. So he just wanted to get the card draw out of the way in round 2. And this is where things get interesting. So Trynet, as you see, started with a Vicovaro Medic, stealing one of my remaining 2 slave infantries from my graveyard. This is pretty good for him, and pretty tough for me because I only have 1 more slave infantry left. That means if I play that slave infantry, all my sentries will only buff by 6 instead of by 12 if I had 2 sets of slave infantries. This is pretty huge in terms of point denial. Even though for Trynet it's only a 10-point play, he ends up denying me something like 12 points total between the 2 sentries. So that's a pretty strong play. Of course, I can't really do much about that. So I just go ahead and use a Novice to fetch my Ointment and then res my last slave infantry, just in case Trynet has something up his sleeve like a second Vicovaro or maybe an Asire. So it looks pretty even so far, but I'm actually kind of worried. Again, I only have 1 set of slave infantry. And now, as you'll see later in the game, I will use my Vilgefortz to kill my slave infantry and then resurrect it again to get a total of 5 infantries on the board. But if I had the second set, again, I would just be able to get way more points. So knowing that this is going to be a long round 3, I opt to go for the Van Hemar play. This will tick a Frost on his roll for quite a while. And knowing that the Alchemy deck runs Ales, it's likely that I'm going to be able to get value out of the Frost for the next 8 turns in the game. Counting the turn that I play the Van Hemar, that is a 18-point play, 22 total with the Van Hemar. Pretty good for a silver. And indeed, we see the first ale come out. Let me just pause for one moment. I actually put the Frost on a row with a doomed slave infantry. There was an argument for putting the Frosts on a row with the non-Doom Slave Infantry. That way, when that infantry dies, I would be able to resurrect it with the Vicovaro Medic I still have laying around in my deck. There's plenty of ways to fetch my bronzes, so I could most likely hit it with something like a Recon, or a Joachim, or a Calvite or something. However, the reason I didn't do that was there's a good chance if I stacked one of the other rows, he would have not played any units into that and would have saved his Mahakamails for last. So it would have actually denied me a lot of value from my Frost. And ultimately, I think my game plan going into this round was to use my own Vicovaro Medic on Trynet's Viper Witcher, which was his only Viper Witcher in the graveyard. Rather than giving myself another Slave Infantry, my goal was to brick Trynet. And we'll actually see this soon, I think. So this round, I go ahead and just play the Calvites. So because Trynet played his Golem, I knew that on top of my deck I had my 6-point Golem. I just wanted to see what I could do with the Calvites, see what I can dig for. And I actually find Cantarella. It's not great because, of course, I'm giving my opponent 13 points. But what Cantarella is able to do here is actually I'm able to select my Novice and then put the 6-point Golem on the bottom of my deck. So I got pretty lucky with the Calvite there, actually. And putting it in the Frost means that Frost row is going to be ticking forever. Not that I needed any more help, to be honest. So Trynet goes ahead and just uses his Black Blood. I don't have great Viper Witcher targets yet, so there's nothing really he can hit. So he just goes ahead and plays one of his few proactive cards. I see this, and I'm pretty happy. Even though the point differential looks huge right now, I'm actually up 2 cards, so as long as I'm able to make up the point gap in 2 cards, technically I'm even with Trynet. So at this point, I just go ahead and burn my Recon. In my deck, I have like 2 Sentries, I think, and then the Vicovaro Novice, or Medic rather. So those are the only cards left in my deck, which means I was at a 66% chance to hit the Medic, which was the play I was going for. If I hit Sentry, it kind of sucks, but it's not the end of the world. Sentry would get 12 points of value with 2 Slave Infantry on the board. That doesn't happen. I hit the Medic, and with the Medic, I'm able to res Trynet's only Viper Witcher from his graveyard. So this play is pretty huge because, as we'll see later in the game, Trynet actually bricks one of his ointments. He just goes for Calvite here. Again, I just don't have great targets on my side of the board, so he goes ahead and just plays the Sire here. And what he chooses is to shuffle my Recruits and his Roach back into the decks. And this makes a lot of sense. Recruit is something I can resurrect with Ointment, and it can fetch one of my remaining 2 Sentries from my deck, which is a very powerful play. And if I happen to have, say, like, 2 Ointments in my hand, those would be bricked right now because I have nothing in my graveyard. I dropped my pencil right there on stream. That's what I was bending down to pick up. But I think at this point, I just decide to go for a decoy on my Van Hemar. So what this does is I realized that the decoy itself was probably not going to get much more value. I have a couple options. I could decoy a Novice, but I have nothing in my graveyard to resurrect, and the only alchemy spells left in my deck are Ointments. I could decoy a Sentry, which I don't currently have on the board, but again, I just don't have many Slave Infantry, so decoying Sentry wouldn't provide me with much value. And then my Vicovaro Medic doesn't really fetch anything good from Trynet's graveyard either. So by decoying the Van Hemar, I'm able to apply another row of Frost. There's 7 turns of Frost ticks that I get from this. So the decoy gave me 14 plus the 3 from the buff on Van Hemar for a total of 17 points, which again is pretty solid for a silver. Well, it's not exactly 17 because I guess the Slave Infantry, when it dies, it's only 1 point. So we'll say 16, 15 points, something like that. Anyways, Trynet just goes for the Ale. His hand right now is kind of awkward. There's not too much he can do, and I don't have any great Viper Witcher targets still. So he just plays what he can. Even though I'm down 50 points here, I do have 2 rows of frost ticking, and my hand is great. I have all 4 of my golds. Whereas Trynet's hand is a bit awkward here. The ointment can fetch a novice, but the novice is more or less bricked. So he has a 2-point play in his hand, and we'll see later what it looks like. So I just go ahead and play the Igni here. My reasoning was I figured 19 points is good enough. It's possible he plays another Ale and then the Ale is able to buff it up even further, but I kind of wanted to wait and see, wait for Trynet to play out his hand before I played some of my more powerful plays. So Igni right there I felt was getting close to max value, so I just went for it. Trynet finally recons out Viper Witcher, kills the 7 points, getting 12 points of value. So I go ahead, at this point I just pull the trigger on my Argeiphontes. So this is the play I was planning to do from the very beginning when Trynet resurrected my slave infantry. I burn my non-doomed version of the slave infantry, so it goes into my graveyard. And this is because I can use my novice in hand to pull ointment, and the ointment can then resurrect my slave infantry, so I would end up getting another 3 slave infantry. This nets me 2 slave infantry, which again makes all my sentries worth 4 more points. Of course, the Argeiphontes pulls out my recruits that Cantarella shuffled, not Cantarella, that the Sire shuffled in. Which pulls out one of my 2 remaining sentries. I'm a little bummed out here because I only have 1 sentry left in my deck. And this poor sentry over here only got 10 points of value. It's not the end of the world, but what I would have wanted to see was my own Asire. If I could have pulled that, I think I could stack the remaining sentry from my graveyard back into my deck. And then that would lead to some very potent pulls with both recruits and Joachim. And reconnaissance off of the Triss. Trynet here goes for the resurrection on the novice, and so he actually, in his tournament report, he said he made a miscalculation. He thought he pulled an Ale with Triss, and that there was still an Ale in his deck, but instead he actually pulled a recon, so he used all his Ales already, which meant there was no target for his novice. And yeah, otherwise what Trynet could have done is he could have used Argeiphontes to burn his Viper Witcher, which then would turn on the ointment in his hand. He could use it to resurrect Viper Witcher. So definitely a bit of a misplay from Trynet there. Anyways, Trynet then goes just for the Argeiphontes, pulls his Mandrake from the top of his deck. Unfortunately, Mandrake was also his last Alchemy card in his deck, so the Vesemir is currently bricked. I think it would have been close if the Novice didn't brick and the Vesemir didn't brick, but I think I still had the game even with those bricks. I think for a bit because I wanted to make sure that I can lock this game down. There's no reason to play too fast and then accidentally brick something and end up losing a game that I had to win on. So after all that, I just go for the Ale. Trynet plays the Vesemir, and I use Triss Recon to pull out my last sentry. And this wins me the round with 16 points to spare, double fog, and I still have a Joachim to pull out of the ranked farm. So all in all, I think, honestly, the turning point in this game was Trynet missing on his Triss. If Triss was able to deny my slave infantry, and then his Vicovaro medic could deny the last slave infantry in my deck, the game would have been very different. So that is game one. I should say also that, I should mention, at the point where Triss misses the Mardrum, had Triss hit Mardrum and Mardrum down 2 of my slave infantry, I would not have dry passed round 2. It would have been too risky to go into round 3 with just one slave infantry in my graveyard. I would have felt highly unfavored. It turns out I ended up having to do that anyways because Trynet had his Vikavara medics, but I would not have intentionally gone into round 3 with just one pair of slave infantry. Instead, I would have tried to bleed Trynet for his finishers in round 2 because I don't want to be facing Alchemy if I don't have access to my slave infantry. But, of course, that is not what happened, and I end up winning that game. So, looks like I fast-forwarded too much. Give me 1 second. Alright, and we go into game 2, which is Brew vs. Shoop against Alchemy again. So, the Brewer into Alchemy matchup, I believe, is slightly favored for Brewer, or maybe even reasonably favored, because the Brewer decks currently all run triple weather. We have Ida, Vadermaker, and Decoy. And Alchemy decks traditionally just don't run any weather clear and run a lot of tall units. So it's pretty soft to getting weathered out. So because of that, and also because Mardrome is able to shrink stuff that get buffed with Ale, I feel pretty good going into this matchup. My hand is nothing too special. I do have a Shoop, which is always nice, and I do have a Triss, which is just a strong gold. But rest of my hand is just a bunch of random bronzes. So I'm on blue coin here. I'm playing first, and I just opt to go for the dry pass. Against Alchemy, this just makes a lot of sense, because Alchemy needs to be able to set up their graveyard, so Trynet will be forced to play into round 2. And as Brewer, I can kind of just lean back, and as long as I am able to keep up in tempo with Trynet in round 2, then I'm fairly comfortable going to round 3. And as you see, I can actually threaten to steal a card from Trynet in round 2. So Trynet just goes ahead and plays a Novice to win the round. And then, of course, because it is Alchemy, he needs to play into the round. So he leads with the Zarsius here. So Shoop obviously just has a bunch of random bronzes, but what Trynet's really looking for are my golds and silvers, so he can know exactly what's in my hand. So at this point in time, he knows I have Shoop. He's busy jotting all that down. And here I actually make a very, shall we say, interesting play. He's at up 17 points right now, and I just go ahead and play my Spy, actually. So normally going 30 points down is not super advisable, but I have a Shiru in my hand. And what Shiru can do is get a double Scorch off of Zarsius and the Spy for a total of 26 plus 4 for a total of 30 points. So Trynet, of course, recognizes this. He knows I'm probably playing Shiru if I'm going to be playing Spy this early. So he knows he has to buff either the Zarsius or his Spy. Now, normally, Alchemy lists run Swallow, and Trynet would be just able to buff Roach. But I noticed that Trynet didn't play any Swallows in game 1, so I suspected his list just didn't run any, which means he needed to either hit his Ale and have a 50-50 chance of buffing the correct target, or he needed to use his Mardrome for just a 5-point play, which is what Trynet ends up doing. What I mean by the 50-50 chance is if he plays Ale and it buffs both Zarsius and Spy, then I get a Scorch off anyways. It has to buff Novice and then Spy for the Ale to actually work out. So it would have been a risky coin flippy play that might just lose Trynet the game on the spot if he went for it, which is why he indeed rather went for the Mardrome. So in this position, yes, Trynet is 35 points ahead, but I'm pretty happy to force out just a 5-point play and for him to burn his Mardrome. The Mardrome could be used later in the game against, some of my targets. So I am in the tank for a little while, but I realized that Trynet probably needs to keep on playing in this round for a bit longer. So I just go ahead and drop a weather. This is another pretty low tempo play. You can see I'm still down by 29 points. But I figured that Trynet will probably at least play 4 more rounds into this because he needs to develop his graveyard. So, and the worst case scenario is even not that bad. If he just passes here, I am able to make up my 29-point deficit in 2 cards, which would mean I get to go into round 3 on even, which is kind of where this whole round started anyways. So it doesn't really matter to me if Trynet passes. As long as I'm able to take the round in 2 cards, then I'm just going par for the course. What I'm really trying to do, though, is I'm actually trying to be able to take the round in 1 card. I'm trying to threaten Trynet with being able to go into round 3 actually up a card. Because right now I'm actually up 3 cards on Trynet. So yeah, if I can take it in this position in 2 cards, you know, I just go in with 1 extra card in round 3, which is huge against Alchemy. Knowing that, I decided to push my tempo a lot further. So the tempo plays in Shoop are basically Barclay, Decoy on Barclay, and the gold cards. I already dropped my weather from Ida, and I don't see a need to drop a second point of weather. I'm afraid of falling too far behind if I, say, pull Vader Maker. So instead I just go for a massive point swing with Broover. So yeah, what is this? Broover plus Barclay plus the Agitator is 10, and then a full 14 points off of the Pyro. So that was a 24-point play. Trynet still wants to stay in the round a bit longer. Goes ahead and plays his Golem, which makes sense. This bricks the top of my deck, so it gives me a forced mulligan in round 3. At this point, though, I'm actually close enough to Trynet's point value that I can threaten to win in 2. So knowing this, I just go ahead and play a half-elf hunter. So I'm actually now within 14 points of Trynet's. And actually, if he passes, I have another fog tick. So I only need to play 13 points to overtake Trynet's current position. This is really scary for Trynet because Trynet is at 8 cards and I'm at 10. So if I just play 1 card and take the advantage, going into round 3 as the Shoop deck against Alchemy and being up a card, that's almost impossible for Alchemy to come back from. And unfortunately for Trynet, his hand is pretty awkward. He didn't draw any of his golds, so it's very difficult for him to play high tempo. And as you see here, I don't even have great targets for his Viper Witchers, so that last Witcher just was an 11-point play. I'm going to just fast forward a little bit. By this point in the game, it was kind of just me just playing out my bronze cards and Trynet playing out whatever he had left in his hands. There wasn't much that Trynet could do in this situation. His hand was just a little too weak because he didn't draw his golds, and my hand was in a very comfortable spot. So I ended up decoying my Barclay just to maintain some more tempo. I can't possibly know that Trynet has no golds in hand, so I just wanted to make sure that I'd be able to cement my advantage and go into round 3 up a card. Like you can see here, there's actually only an 8-point difference, and I'm up 2. Trynet goes and I think plays 1 more card here. Oh no, never mind. So he just passes there. He wants to save his Calvate for round 3 because it's one of his few high tempo plays left in hand. And I just go ahead and take it with a Mahakam Guard. So we're going to round 3. I managed to go up a card because I forced Trynet to play into round 2. And did that weird spy shenanigans that forced out the 5-point Mardrum. My hand is great. I have 3 golds. I have a 9-point Swordmaster. At this point, my hand is very reactive. So my hand was very reactive, so I just went ahead and played Triss and to resurrect my Agitator. This was actually, I think, my only proactive play in hand outside of just slamming Shoop, which is never really great on an empty board. The Agitator ended up pulling a Pyro, which was, not great, but honestly, it's fine. The only two Dwarves left in my deck were Pyro and Dwarven Mercenary. Obviously, Mercenary would have been the better pull. It would have been 11 points instead of 5. But this is fine because I'm up a card. I don't need to play super greedy here or get super lucky. I just need to, not brick any of the cards in my hand, play reasonably well, and the game should be mine. Yep, so I got a target for my Panther, so I just went ahead and played it out. I actually think I probably should have used the Shiru there. There is a risk in this matchup of me just bricking the Shiru if Trynet doesn't have anything like an Ale in hand. So I definitely should have, I think, used Shiru earlier than I did. But it turns out pretty well, as we'll see. Trynet goes for the Black Blood because his hand is pretty reactive. He doesn't want to use a Viper Witcher yet because my highest is a 5. So it would only be a 10-point play. He plays the Ekimara, and here, again, I could just burn the Shiru. Like, I don't need to get insane value off of the Shiru to win this game, so I don't need to risk potentially bricking Shiru in the future. Instead, though, I go ahead and use my Swordmaster on the Ekimara, which is fine. It gets the Swordmaster out of my hand. Gets full value, 18-point swing. Pretty solid. It does give Trynet a Viper Witcher target, which is still okay. If we're trading evenly like that, I'm just going to win because I have one card up. I go ahead and Ointment here off of the Sage, and just pull something dumb. Yeah, so I just pull the Swordmaster here, and shoot down his 5. Again, I still could have Shiru'd. He had 2 5s on the board. Shiru would have been 14 points of value. And I definitely think I should have. But I didn't, and I actually kind of get rewarded in the end for not doing so. He goes ahead and fetches an Ale with Vesemir. And I'm like, ooh. So Trynet now has 2 9s on the field. So my last special in my deck is Mardrome. So I just use my Mardrome to shrink the Vesemir down to 3, which lines up the 2 9s nicely for my Scorch. There's not many great ways for Trynet to play around this, and he loses a 50-50. You can see my face. I just slammed the Shiru down for an easy 30-point value, which I was trying to do in round 2 anyways. Look at me, I'm so smug. I'm like, yeah, that just happened. But yeah, not too much exciting going on in the last game. Honestly, by making the spy play in round 2 and forcing out kind of the awkward sequencing from Trynet and going up a card cemented that game. If Trynet had a couple more golds in hand, he might have been able to force tempo and go into round 3 on even. But again, Shoop is favored there, so I took the match. Alright, so that is the first review video. I hope I wasn't too rambly through this. I will adjust as I continue on this video series. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next video.